Morgan, who is a support officer, and Tiffany Lynch, who's the transport strategy manager. So welcome to both of you. I'm sure we'll catch up and get to know each other as time goes forward. And we've got Carly Friesen here from DFT. So welcome, Carly. And if, as always, I think everybody has, if we can just mute our microphones when we're not speaking, it should improve the quality of the sound. So if we're happy to do that, please. As I say, we are now broadcasting. We have today apologies from Ian Phillips, and I can't see, but we do have a sub here in Ian's place. Rob Humby is, as I say, offered a LEP meeting. Ross McNally is there as well, and John Housel is not here today. So we move on to agenda item 3, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. So is there anything on there that members want to raise, or can I sign them eventually as a true record? No dissent, so I take that as a positive. That they'll go on to the TFSE website. Declarations of interest. Is there anything that any members want to raise with agenda items that are on today's agenda? No. And again, thank to all of the members for filling in your declaration of interest forms, and if there's any further ones, if you could please get those in, and again they will then be placed on the TFSE website. So I think that's really good. Agenda item 4, we don't have any statements from the public today, and so we don't have any public time. I'm going to move with your permission, Highways England presentation till after agenda item 10, simply because Adam's not able now to join until 2:30. So hopefully he'll be here, and we'll take it at the end of the meeting. So we'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the COVID-19 report, and ask Mark to introduce.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. The purpose of the report before you is to agree the technical report that we've had done on the COVID-19 work, and just to illustrate some of the key findings of that report, we're just going to, myself and Stephen Bishop from Steer, who's led the technical work, are just going to run through a brief presentation, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of that. So if I can just ask Russell to boot up the presentation.
Just bear with me a sec, just having the usual technical gremlins. Sorry, just 1 second. Here we go. Can you see what you should be seeing, Mark?
Yes, that's it. If you can just put it in presentation mode, that'd be great.
Sorry, there might just be a tiny little time lag. There we go.
I'll ask you to move on. If you can move on to the first slide, that would be great. Just put it in presentation mode. Excellent.
Haven't got mine yet.
Is that not working, Mark? I'm in presentation mode.
No, that's fine. If we can't do that, that's fine. I think everyone can see what we have on the screen there. If we can't get it into full presentation mode, the words are there. So just the context for the work. If members will recall that when we brought the transport strategy for you to agree in July, members themselves raised slight concerns that the transport strategy had been drafted in a pre-pandemic situation, very much drafted through 2019 before the pandemic came along, and members were clear in agreeing to the transport strategy that they would like to see further work undertaken to try and understand the potential impacts of the pandemic on the further development of the strategy. So the thing that we were particularly focusing on was not the immediate sort of impacts in the here and now, but trying to anticipate what recovery from COVID might look like once the pandemic came to an end. So what we did as an extension to our existing contract with Steer and WSP on the transport strategy, asked Steer to undertake some work for us to try and understand and look and try and see what some of these longer term impacts might be. Just moving on to slide, Russell. And as we know, the pandemic has had significant impacts on all of our lives, and I'm sure as we move forward, more and more are feeling those impacts in terms of our friends and family. And as we know, we've recently passed the 100,000 people who've died from COVID. But COVID has also had dramatic impacts on the transport system, and what this slide shows is a graph of data that the DFT are regularly publishing that sort of tracks the impact that the pandemic has had on different modes of transport. And the three red lines show us when we went into the first lockdown, and then we have the second and third line showing us the second and third lockdowns. Dramatic decreases in initially in public transport use and car use. Some, following the end of the first lockdown, some recovery back of those levels back to what might be sort of called pre-COVID levels, certainly from a car transport point of view, but public transport not recovering back. And we can see that as we now are in the third lockdown, we've sort of got the same effect again, with dramatic increases in public transport use and also car use. The green line at the top shows the impact in terms of cycling use, and we can see initially in those warm summer months there was quite a dramatic increase in cycling activity. That's declined over time unexpectedly as we move into winter, but I think one of the longer lasting impacts is that those people who have been surveyed to say, will you continue to cycle and walk more, are certainly indicating that they will do that in the future. But tremendous uncertainty about what happens as we move forward in terms of which of these patterns and how they settle down, how these patterns settle down over time. So the COVID, it's clear COVID has had a dramatic impact on the transport system, but it also, we have to say, it presents us with opportunities to change the way we do things. There are certain things that have happened during the pandemic. Some are very, very negative and the things that we need to try and address, but also some positive changes which potentially help us as TFSE on our journey to our 2050 vision. Just moving on to the slide, Russell. So moving forward, and the context for the work that was undertaken, many knowns and unknown. We don't know whether surviving COVID-19 grants immunity, including from the new variants, and for how long that immunity lasts, and whether herd immunity could build in the population over time. We don't know, even though it's great news about the vaccine coming on stream, but we still don't really know how effective the vaccine will be, whether we'll need to have continuous annual jabs to keep our immunity levels up, and how quickly and how effectively the rollout is going to be. So as a consequence, the sort of situation we have at the moment is that the policy and behavioural responses that we've seen are likely to continue to be incremental and tactical as the situation continues to evolve. Just moving on, Russell. So in terms of the work that's been undertaken, we've adopted a two-pronged approach, and Stephen is going to talk in a little bit more detail about this work, but essentially there was a technical investigation using a scenario-based approach, the approach we adopted to develop the transport strategy using our existing Southeast economy, land use and transport model to try and look at the impacts that the COVID pandemic might have, particularly over the next 3 years or so. We then also, another strand to the work was an impact analysis, looking at what's happened to date in terms of some of the impacts that we've seen, particularly in the Southeast, and try and explore how those might evolve in the future, with the conclusions from the work being an overall synthesis of the findings from those two different streams. So I'm now just going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to pick up here and talk about some of the results of the technical work, technical investigation, the impact analysis that's been undertaken.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Russell, if you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide, I'll go through the technical work using a modified version of the modelling tool CELUM that supported development of the strategy. The first thing to say is we've continued taking a scenario-based approach. This is helpful in that it helps us to encompass the uncertainty that is inherent that we all experience through our lives and work every day under the pandemic, but it looks at a number of scenarios of what could be or what plausibly could be our future, and then defines a range of possible outcomes or futures. And therefore, it is not attempting to say this will be the future and to set targets. And they do not represent forecasts of what will occur. Again, all of these range of outcomes are to help us understand the uncertainty and the range of outcomes. And they're created and offered to help further analysis and development of policy and strategy, both nationally, subnationally, and locally. Next slide, please, Russell. So the 4 scenarios we've looked at, we've named cycles of lockdown, adaptation, therapeutics, and vaccine. And these have been developed through internal research and innovation project within STEER, but also then tested with Check and Challenge with a number of representatives of the Transport Forum and Transport Strategy and Working Group. And they follow basically principally the public health outcome. That is, do we remain in cycles of lockdown? Do we learn to contain the virus and adapt to it? The second scenario. Do we contain and adapt, but actually get quite effective treatments? Or do we find ourselves in a scenario where we have a vaccine? And it's probably fair to say that we found ourselves initially in the first scenario. We thought we were moving to the second. There was even some good news quite early on that therapies or treatments had been developed that were minimizing hospital time and the number of patients that were requiring ventilators and the like. We then moved back into a second lockdown. We then had good news about vaccine. We now have renewed concerns about further cycles of lockdown and new variants. So whilst none of these are target seeking as to what the future will be, hopefully we can see that we have oscillated and find ourselves in a space between all of these different scenarios. And also that we have variation within the country, within the region, and we also have variation internationally about where we are. So whilst it could be argued that we're in a vaccine scenario and we would have started administering the vaccine much sooner than the autumn winter of this calendar year, I think it is helpful that these scenarios have held that we are somewhere within this space. Next slide, please. So we modified the model to take into account a number of the particular or unique characteristics of lockdown and of COVID. So we isolated those proportions of the economy that were working in industrial sectors that had high proportions of key workers. We modified the model to be able to represent higher levels of working from home, of furlough, and a number of other characteristics. But across all of those 4 scenarios, the decrement to the economy against our preferred scenario, where we want to be heading through delivery of the transport strategy, is a negative impact on the economy of 10 to 20 billion pounds of GVA per year. And that's across all of those scenarios. The dashed green line is the business as usual scenario. And it's not to say that we couldn't be starting to outperform that in the future. But all of these scenarios assume we continue deployment of the transport strategy. So it's 10 to 20 billion pounds of GVA decrement against the preferred scenario, and it still assumes we continue to deliver the transport strategy. Next slide, please, Russell. Travel to work. Mark's already highlighted the significant changes of national data, but we also know that there's variation locally, and the reports that underpin this work provide a lot more of that local variation within the Southeast. But travel to work levels do not return to the same extent that the economy will. it is forecast that the return to work will take longer, and both economic and travel recovery will take years rather than months. Under the vaccine scenario, the yellow line that's closest to the sustainable route to growth scenario, the scenario underpinning the transport strategy, we have a quicker release of social distancing policies. Employers encourage their staff back to the workplace for those who had been working at home. But we also have suppressed levels because there are high levels of unemployment. There are fewer people commuting and traveling. It is our analysis that says the decrease in travel to work outweighs the shift to car travel that we've been seeing away from public transport. So overall, we do expect to see lower levels of congestion. And when you factor in peak spreading and changing spatial patterns, it creates some quite interesting challenges or opportunities for the delivery of the transport strategy in the area study programme, but just how our travel patterns will be changing into the future. Next slide, please. So against these different scenarios, we then tested a number of additional transport interventions. Remember, all of these scenarios assume delivery of the transport strategy, but the question was, what else could we be delivering nationally, subnationally, locally to support recovery? So we looked at 8 different tests. The first was to increase rail capacity halfway back to pre-COVID levels from a point back in July, August 2020. The second test was to do the same by increasing the capacity of our buses halfway back to pre-COVID levels. Then looked at reducing rail fares, reducing bus fares, reducing the time it takes to walk and cycle places by 10% and 20%, sustaining and increasing the levels of home working by 20% in addition to the levels that we had back in July last year, and then also the ability to increase workplace capacity. So this could be as a result of ending social distancing policies and workplaces having greater capacity. We then looked at a number of bundles of those tests, those that focus more on public transport, and then those that focus more on active travel. Our findings were that demand for travel is much more sensitive to the capacity of the network than to fares. So being able to get more people on the buses, on the trains, would have a greater impact in reducing car mode share and improving sustainable transport mode share. Improving walking and cycling journey times were important. There's quite a lot that's hidden in the rounding of these figures to integers. But also the model is very strategic. It covers the whole of the region. So this is not to say that those interventions to support walking and cycling are not incredibly important locally. I think a third takeaway here is that if we increase workplace capacity, but don't facilitate our connectivity and accessibility by public transport and by active modes, we'll simply see higher levels of car travel, which won't be in support of the broader goals and priorities of the transport strategy and probably the majority of local transport plans. We had the best cumulative effect by looking at those interventions that do most to increase capacity, both on the transport network and in the workplace. Next slide, please, Russell. So a summary of the key findings from this technical work. Recovery will take years and not months. I think we all realize that. Some of the analysis showed that in the best case scenario, maybe economic recovery might be 3 to 5 years, but in less favorable outcomes, we may never return to the trajectory of the economy that we were forecasting through delivery of the transport strategy and associated spatial and economic planning. Already mentioned this several times, the outcomes of all the scenarios are still based on the delivery of the transport strategy. There is still great uncertainty in large ranges and possible outcomes. The reduction in total number of trips outweighs the increase in car mode share under all the scenarios. And furthermore, we have been witnessing peak spreading and changing travel patterns spatially. Fifth takeaway is the importance of supporting home working. Now, not everyone is able to work from home. We estimate it's between 40 and 50% of the workforce in the Southeast are able to work from home. Doesn't mean it's necessarily enjoyable or favourable, but the importance of supporting home working, the importance of increasing public transport capacity and confidence in public transport beyond what was already proposed in the transport strategy, as well as facilitating active travel, again, in addition to the transport strategy. So what are the messages? What are the messages for the area studies? We need to promote digital connectivity. We need to promote sustainable transport capacity and connectivity. And we need to promote flexibility and resilience of both our transport networks, but also our transport planning approaches. Next slide, please, Russell. So we'll move on to a wider piece of analysis, considering the impacts of COVID, as well as other forecasts, for example, from the OECD and the Office for Budget Responsibility and central government. And we've put these under a number of different categories of certainty. So those things that we can be very certain about, relatively sure, and have been a result of some of our forecasting, those things that present a realistic possibility, or perhaps a little bit of myth busting of those things that we are very unsure about still, and our analysis is not pointing us in the direction of those things. So this is the first of 5 categories, the speed of recovery. So COVID-19 has had the most significant economic impact on the Southeast for a generation, impacting economies with greatest, or having the most negative or severe impact on those local economies with the greatest reliance on aviation. A lot of us will have seen a recent report from Centre for Cities that showed economies of Slough and Crawley, I think some of the largest urban areas with the greatest impact due to their reliance on the aviation sector. Those that have strong reliance on the visitor economy and hospitality, and those that have lower skilled employment bases, all typically being those that have been hardest hit. We can be relatively sure that the economy will rebound as we roll out a vaccine, but it will take years rather than months, as already mentioned. The speed with which the economy will recover, there's realistic possibility that in the Southeast it will do relatively well. Again, this has been further supported by a lot of the analysis by Centre for Cities. And it's also thought that there is pent-up demand as well. People eager to be able to have day trips to the coast, or to be able to return to town and city centres for entertainment, for leisure, for retail more fully, as well as the return to work and strengthening of the economy. What we cannot be unsure of this stage is really what the long-term structural changes will be to the economic makeup of the Southeast. Are we seeing fundamental shifts in the industrial sectors that will thrive within the Southeast? Are we seeing significant changes in the age or the demographic profile that will affect the speed of recovery? Next slide, please, Russell. The next area we considered is whether we will have a new work we conducted for the transport strategy showed that only about 13% of all trips or commute trips were to or from London. Again, a bit of myth busting there, but nonetheless, the Southeast has an important commuting trips to London from the Southeast and will continue to do so, certainly whilst we have stay-at-home type policies. We can be relatively sure that the increased time spent in the Southeast has provided this relative, it's a very important word here, a relative boost to local economies, as people tend to spend time, travel, operate, spend locally. And there is a realistic possibility that there will be a permanent shift which restructures the relationship the Southeast have with London. We know from our work, for example, with local enterprise partnerships, that use of the Getting Building Fund is being used to support a number of commercial sites where companies and developers are saying there is a lot of increased demand for the development of sites for commercial premises outside of London, or companies that are moving to a more localized model of employment. What we can't be sure, or very unsure of, is that London's daytime population will not recover to pre-COVID levels, and that there will be a permanent shift in the UK's economic geography. It's just too soon to tell, is our view. Next slide, please, Russell. The next is the importance of polycentricity. The Southeast is made up of lots of medium to large-sized towns and cities and their rural hinterlands. And thus far, medium-sized towns and cities in the Southeast have been relatively resilient to their larger comparators nationally. Obviously, again, the Centre for Cities work has looked at places like Slough and Crawley that are struggling, and all places are struggling to some extent. But it would appear that the local economies of the Southeast have been more resilient to the larger conurbations of the Midlands and the North. What can be relatively sure about, that short-term investment in active travel and public transportation will make our economies and our society healthier. It will also make them more attractive places to live, work and visit. If we are able to travel to, from and around these places safely and sustainably, that will make them more attractive. There's a realistic possibility that there will be higher long-term population growth in the smaller urban centres relative to large comparators. So as people migrate outwards from London, and then as people move outwards from some of the larger major economic hubs of the southeast to smaller communities, there is a lot of leading indicator data that is suggesting that this is happening and could endure. We're very unsure, though, that there's been a lot of talk about 15-minute cities, and we're doing a lot of analysis on this ourselves, that as a result of this, that all communities in the southeast will be living in some sort of idyllic, utopian 15-minute city environment. That is not what we are saying. However, being able to make sure that people can travel sustainably, not just on those longer distance routes from major economic hubs to London, but those interurban routes, being able to make those local journeys more sustainably. It's going to be very important to be looking at those localized movement patterns as well as the more strategic ones. Next slide, please, Russell. Rising inequality. There's a lot of analysis that we've conducted and drawn on from other organizations that are showing that COVID is having very asymmetrical impacts on our communities, that those groups and protected characteristics that typically are most at risk of these are experiencing the impacts of this hardest, and that is exacerbated inequality. We know, for example, the impacts of unemployment are likely to fall hardest on those from lower income households. For example, people who have underlying health conditions are being impacted upon more severely by COVID, and also that it's having asymmetric impacts by race and ethnic minority groups. We can be relatively sure that those at the bottom of the income scale will find it hardest to get back on their feet after the pandemic. There's a realistic possibility that the gap between the most deprived places in the southeast and the rest of the region will increase. Again, Centre for Cities was suggesting that economies such as Reading's might bounce back quicker than, say, that of Slough. But we are unsure that long-term inequality will have a significant impact on the livability of urban spaces. It is possible for intervention to help address inequality. Next slide, please, Russell. Technological and behavioural acceleration. We can be very certain that the number of individuals who are working from home has increased dramatically, along with increase in things such as home delivery. And we therefore see increased vehicle movements associated with online retail. We can be relatively sure that the number of individuals working from home will decrease compared to the height of the pandemic, but remain higher than pre-COVID levels. I guess there is a running thought that the longer these patterns endure, the stickier they'll become. But I don't know about you, but anecdotally, certainly going into a third lockdown, I'm probably craving a return to the office more than I was in the first and second lockdown. So I'm not sure actually how sticky some of these trends will be. There's a realistic possibility that urban centre office spaces are no longer required to the extent that they were or growing at, but they will. There may be a change in commercial profile of how employers and developers create new sites. But something we can't be sure about is that new technologies will be used to ensure that city centre spaces are car-free and people-friendly spaces. We need to think more broadly about how we make our city and urban space centres more inhabitable, livable, and more friendly. Next slide, please, Russell. So 6 key findings across all of this analysis. The demand for travel could, and there's already evidence of this, spread to outside the peaks and move away from some of the more congested radial routes. So perhaps this dogma over the last couple of decades of focusing predominantly on radial routes from the southeast into London needs rethinking. The investment in digital technology has the potential to facilitate economic resilience and recovery. Obviously, subject to people being able to access digital technology and there being suitable coverage and speeds across the southeast. Increased levels of home working may reduce trip chaining. That is the ability on our return from a commute to be able to pick up some food shop, to be able to drop children off at school or pick up or visit a doctor's, go to do dry cleaning, etc. we need to think that this isn't just about the commute. We can't fixate only on commuting. There are many other journey purposes, and therefore additional numbers of trips may be made during the day. There's also a possibility, although no firm evidence of this, that if more households have cars available during the day, because it is not being used for a commute, that car trips could become more, have a higher percentage of mode share for trips that are made during the day, such as grocery trips or leisure trips. It will be harder to accommodate more dispersed travel patterns by frequent fixed-route public transport. Now, this creates challenges as well as opportunities, but if we're going to see more patterns of interurban travel or a higher number of origins and destinations that need to be served, maybe more on-demand or demand-responsive services might need to be considered, or the use of smaller vehicles, for example. So the area studies will need to be agile, not only responding to some of these shorter-term changes in patterns of transport and travel demand, but also think about some of the longer-term changes in the economy or spatially. And on to the next slide, which I think is my final slide, please, Russell. To end perhaps on a slightly more positive note, there are opportunities that the area studies need to embrace, as well as other planning activities, to reimagine about how our mobility can be more sustainable. The importance of digital connectivity to support home working and remote access to services and amenities where possible and where desirable. Further integration of strategic spatial and transport planning being recommended, because if we are going to see changes in demography and where people live and work and visit, transport needs to respond and integrate. The importance of investment in active travel to provide capacity for safe neighbourhoods and direct routes, and to support behaviour change to promote these packages. The importance of bus and shared mobility, sustaining and increasing public transport capacity, accessibility and connectivity is necessary as a direct response. Key workers must be able to get to the schools, to the hospitals, deliveries must be able to happen, etc. There are many people who need to be commuting by bus and are reliant on bus and train. But it's also very important for managing congestion, both into our towns and cities and between them. And finally, I think there's a particularly interesting opportunity around rail. There's a whole range of options. They're not all aligned and concurrent. From further metroization of routes into London, for example, more stops rather than fewer express services, as well as turning that onto some of the region's largest major economic hubs, so the Solent, Greater Brighton, Gatwick, Diamond, North Kent, M25 Southwest Quadrant, to look again at metroization of rail services there. But there actually could also be opportunities for more paths for longer distance express services and freight services. These are all things that the area studies need to grapple with. Next slide, please, Russell. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to share that with you. There's a lot more detail. There's a lot more we could collectively be looking at together, but we'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Stephen. Mark, is there anything else you want to add, or shall we go direct to questions? Okay.
Yes, let's go to questions.
If I start with Ian and then Amy.
You're on mute, Ian.
Keith, thank you, and Stephen, thank you. That was really interesting. I just wondered, could we have a copy of those slides?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Good. Amy?
Thanks, Keith. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you for a really interesting report, and the presentation was really interesting, seeing all those different future scenarios. And yeah, I just wanted to make some comments really, and a question at the end. So obviously the COVID pandemic has had a dramatic impact on everyone, and also in Brighton and Hove, how we do business as a transport authority. And it is easy often to jump to the negative, but we've also seen how agile and resourceful we can be in bouncing back and still delivering significant change to our transport systems. And I really think that one thing the pandemic has shown us is that we can make sweeping change in a very small amount of time. And this makes me a bit more optimistic about the future and how we can do this with transport and the climate emergency. And I was really pleased to see the details of the positive impacts of investing in active travel in particular. As here, we've been dealing with the impacts of the pandemic, and we're doubling our efforts to secure health benefits through the rapid introduction of cycle lanes and improving walking infrastructure. And in turn, increasing our pace on reducing carbon. And during the last lockdown, we undertook the largest climate assembly on reducing carbon emissions in our transport system. And we're also working with Steer actually on a livable city centre programme and an ultra low emission zone for the city. So those have been some really positive things for us. And I'd like to ask, well, Steer and maybe just the whole board, if Transport for the South East would consider holding a citizens' assembly to discuss this kind of thing, especially on how we can decarbonise transport in the context of the pandemic, but also the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come back to that in the summing up, if that's all right. But thank you for the other points you raised. And we've got Lynn and then Vanessa.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentation. Thank you for that, and very thought-provoking. I got one concern. I'm sure all of you have seen the government's most recent campaign urging people not to use public transport. I don't think it's actually gone live yet, but it worries me to death. Here we are trying to promote public transport and cut congestion, etc. The bus companies have done, certainly they have in the Portsmouth area, done everything they can to make it as safe as possible to travel on buses and on trains. But I'm just wondering, as a big transport authority, well, not an authority, but a group, the Transport for the South East, should we not be sending something to the government to say this is irresponsible and totally against what we're looking for? I've already written, but I'm sure other people could do the same thing.
Do we want to note these and come back at the end, Mark? Are you happy to do that?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got Vanessa, please.
Yes, thank you. It's Vanessa Rodens from South Downs National Park. I just wanted to say, well, firstly, well done on this report. I mean, it must be just so hard writing something when things are just moving all the time. And it kind of feels like we're probably going into maybe a blend of those scenarios with the vaccine and adaptation and possibly winter lockdowns in some form. You know, it's going to be difficult. Also, I mean, I just got to layer on top of that the effect that Brexit's going to have on our, SMEs in the area. The red tape that's is added on is just making exporting and importing kind of just making it non-economically viable, really. So that's going to have an impact on movement and logistics. But I wonder if that balances the increase in the online shopping that we're seeing, and whether we need to think about more distribution hubs. But I also wanted to ask you, Stephen, if you had looked on the impact that that increase in online shopping is going to have on the smaller towns in our area, because I'm just thinking of hollowing out of high streets. Is that going to move them more to residential spaces? Could we invest in green infrastructure in those areas to make them nicer places to live, so they're a bit more of a hub? They've got the transport there. Maybe that's where we put the affordable housing. Kind of what impact does that have? And I'm just really pleased to see you stressing about the digital, investing in the digital, investing in the rail. We've got, I mean, you say it's only 40 to 50% of people working from home could work from home. But I mean, that's massive. I mean, that's really massive. And you think of the impact of just none of us going to these meetings. I mean, are we really going to seriously all going to meet up in person to do this again? We're going to use this technology going forward. It's just brilliant. So I think, there is a bigger picture. There's still more to think about. And I just think as Transport for South East, we should really be stressing, especially with the time that we're looking at there of recovery of the economy, is just let's pause the road building. The roads we've got, let's make them really good. They work well, but really we should be calling on pausing the road building. It doesn't look like that's going to help long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. We've got Michael, Steve, and Tony and Colin. Michael.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, excellent presentation, and none of us obviously know the answers, but what I thought was interesting was in the context graph, it shows that bus and rail hasn't recovered from the first lockdown. phrases that I took away from what you said was decrease in return to work outweighs the shift to car from public transport. In other words, the number of public transport journeys have gone down, as we know. People have transferred into the car, and whilst the car journeys in total are lower at the moment, if there is a return to more journeys on the road, then it could suggest more car journeys and less public transport. Would you agree that the biggest challenge we have, or is it the biggest opportunity is around public transport, and this in itself might lead to the biggest adjustment to our preferred strategy?
Thank you, Michael. We'll pick that up shortly. Steve, welcome again.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting, very detailed. My question, I've got two parts to it. It's about buses and bus companies. Here in Southampton, like most areas, the bus companies are being supported by public money. They are deregulated private companies, and we're supporting them. We work in partnership with them. What is your view on the future scenarios for the commercial bus sector, and how will they be impacted? The second part to my question is the DfT have said that they're going to be issuing a bus strategy early in 2021. And do we know when that will come out, and do we have any idea of what's going to be in it?
Thanks, Steve. Tony, then Colin, and then Alex.
Thank you, Keith. Just picking up on that last point from Steve, not all bus companies are privately owned. We still own ours in Reading, and proud to do so. But of course, the salient point you made is valid, namely they are all on live support from the DfT. And the worrying thing is that the DfT could pull the plug with only 8 weeks notice. I don't think they will only give 8 weeks notice, but obviously the future of public transport, whether it be buses or rail, is very much a question mark. Although, of course, the future of buses is altogether more flexible because, of course, they don't run on fixed rails. And one of the options that's mentioned in this report is the flexibility around future public transport provision in a way that is less radially focused and perhaps more opportunities around that. Although I think it still points to a form of regulation in that, perhaps privately owned companies, but still a degree more public steering of those future services, because I don't think the market left to itself will identify or support those changes. But coming back to the report itself, a very good report. I would like to see us circulating this to all our member authorities, because of course this is primarily focused on our transport strategy and the what ifs in the current climate. But of course, as local authorities, and particularly those of us that are unitaries, but it applies to districts and counties, that we have a role in place shaping and planning that goes wider than just transport. And I hope very much that the government, and particularly Robert Jenrick, will reflect on some of the stupidities of the proposed so-called planning reforms that were drafted largely before the pandemic and have been shown, I hope, to be increasingly irrelevant to the needs of planning our urban centres, our towns and villages, and our communities across the south. Because if the planning changes are implemented, our role as planning authorities is effectively nil. And of course, we as the local authorities have that wider place shaping responsibility. The Centre for Cities report was touched on, and there's a lot of common ground in the two reports. And I was also looking earlier for a separate engagement that I've got in Bill Grimsey's update last year on his review about the future of town and city centres. And of course, the issue of hollowing out that was referred to, I think, by Vanessa is something that we have to be very focused on, and that brings us back to the appropriate mix of planning powers to ensure that the diversity of our towns and cities and villages are maintained. Because if the volume house builders get their way, and Robert Jenrick does as he is being told by them, then we'll simply have a load of houses and dead centres to boot. So the need to plan actively is even more accentuated. I think as a subnational transport board, we must remember that we have that strategic remit. And while some of this impacts obviously and raises questions about what's happening locally, we are not there to plan the local framework. And the question that Vanessa rightly raised about the strategic issue of, for example, should we pause new road building, is something that I think is very relevant to our responsibilities as a board. Should we be saying to central government that in light of the changes, in light of the much perhaps more even spread of traffic, and in the absence of peak hour spikes, is the case for road investment that has been put forward and assessed by the DfT as valid as it was? And what would be the outcome if we feed in many of the assumptions or just queries that have been raised in this report? Michael Payne rightly raised the issue as well about the opportunities that this presents to us. So I'm trying to get my head round how this very good report leads to us reviewing at a strategic level our inherited, albeit very recent, transport strategy, because I think our constituent authorities, all our member authorities, would be expecting us to focus on that aspect. So I very much welcome this as obviously the start rather than the conclusion of a process, Keith. I'd like to see it circulated along with those helpful slides, and then perhaps we have a further discussion on how this really feeds back to the transport strategy, and perhaps a further dialogue or continuing dialogue with the DfT, because the case for further investment in public transport and active travel, and Amy from Brighton rightly referred to the investment opportunities around active travel. And my final point relates to that, because I think there's a typo. There's only one typo I spotted, but on page 92, at the very last recommendation, there's the statement: while in isolation, active travel interventions do not directly lead to high positive impacts against the metrics analysed using a regional model, underline regional model, at a local level, such interventions are, now it says import and, I think it just means important, are important for public health and road safety, etc. And I think this is one of the fundamental issues that highway and transport authorities will have to get to grips with, because whilst Brighton and Hove and Reading have introduced successful active travel measures quickly, we have also introduced some unsuccessful ones very quickly. And there's been blowback in a number of towns and cities. And what we cannot afford to have are active travel initiatives trashed by the Jeremy Clarkson lobby on the basis of a handful of mistakes, whilst we get successful interventions elsewhere. That Chair's slightly hopping around because I was trying to pick up on some of the comments that were made earlier. But again, thanks for a very good report, which I, as I say, would like to see circulated to all our member authorities. Thank you, Keith. Slightly longer than I'd anticipated.
And not a problem for me. I'm sure Mark and Stephen are logging all this so that they can come back on it a bit later. So I've got Colin, Alex, Martin. So if we go with Colin next, please. You're muted, Colin.
I thought I'd hit that button. Sorry about that. Thank you for that, Keith, and thank you, Tony. I'm sure getting the questions out of that and responding to that will be quite interesting. Agree with the circulation of the slides. I think that would be really useful. I totally agree with investment in digital. I think that's really important. We're talking a lot about public transport, and with the recovery of aviation going to be a longer period of time, there is a lot of public transport that feeds the worker and also the passengers into and out of the airport, and that's going to be a longer sustainable problem in retaining that public transport and the and supporting the airports to make sure their recovery is sort of brought forward as soon as possible. So have you looked at the areas around the airport from a public transport point of view, and the airports themselves as part of this study, and what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Colin. Alex.
Well, thank you very much for the report. I think it was excellent, and I think a lot of people are looking at this issue. Transport for London, we certainly are. We're looking at what it means in the short term, but also the long term for the growth of the city and the relationship with the wider southeast, but also travel trends as well. I think what I always find with these reports is that I think it's very difficult to have that kind of crystal ball gazing about what's going to happen. But at the end of it, I think the key thing that you need to move on to fairly quickly is, well, what are we going to do about it? Because I think it's that's what we all need to grapple with. And my kind of starter for 10 of the 3 areas where I think you need to look at going forward. One is public transport confidence and confidence in public transport, because it's quite clear public transport services are on life support. Passengers have abandoned the system, and we have a big job to get them back on it. And I just think some further work on how we get confidence back in those networks and get people back on them. And I think we're in a particularly difficult time where it's very easy to say, well, let's just cut services if no one's there. Well, that could well be self-defeating in the longer term, in terms of you get a longer term abandonment of these services and people just never come back. So I do think a further piece of work on how you get confidence and ridership back in our public transport system is critical. The second area I think it's worth looking at is reviewing business cases of schemes that are in our portfolio at the moment, because so much of the justification of our investment programme in Transport for London, but also presumably your authorities one, is how do we deal with peak capacity? Well, we haven't had a morning peak in London since March, so it's a big change in how we assess schemes going forward, and I think it's really important that we do reassess those and reevaluate which ones are the important ones in the post-pandemic area. And then the third comment I'd make is a third and final comment is I think it's important to look at the opportunities as well. With more people working from home and having leisure activity and retail activity from home, it does give you that opportunity to reconsider your local town centre's offer and how you make that more attractive for people to live and work locally in a more sustainable way. And I think that all feeds into the decarbonisation agenda as well. So key thing is really good report, but the next piece of work is actually more important to think about what do you do in response to it. That's the key. Thanks.
Alex. Martin, very apt that you take this point just to tell us how the buses are really going to recover. So,
right, okay, I'll polish up the crystal ball then. So, yeah, thanks. I'm really impressed by the detail of the work that we just heard about, and what I'm particularly impressed to see is the development of a model that can be revisited. And I appreciate that will take money and resource, but it seems to be essential that we keep revisiting on a regular basis. So as we become clearer about government interventions, whether they're directly in transport or whether they're into the areas of our lives that drive demand for transport, that we can start to refine the picture and start to get a clearer sense of how things are rolling out. It's very tempting and easy sometimes for us to assume we know how it's all going to play out, because of what we've seen so far. But I think we've also seen lots of lessons that reminded us that we got some of that wrong at the beginning and we'll keep getting some of that wrong. So we've got to keep updating our view of the world. And I totally support what Tony's had to say about planning. I can't, I can't do enough to emphasise my support for everything he said about the planning changes. And indeed, Amy's view about sustainably investing in the future of movement. And there's no doubt that we can't afford to have a car-borne recovery into the long term. That's simply going to lead to congestion, which, with all the downsides that brings for the economy, for social life of our towns and cities, and for public health, even as they're changing to electric cars, that issue doesn't go away. So I think it's really vital that we reflect on what we consider core, that's going to remain core after the pandemic. And for me, with decarbonisation, with the health and public welfare benefits of public transport, I don't think we should get carried away by some of the images and the graphs that showed the relative decline of public transport. Let's not capture that image of that graph and let that drive our thinking, because those are all relative things. And don't forget, I've given examples before where bus services in some parts of the area have dropped to levels which were 50% of what they were before the pandemic. But that was to levels which in many towns and cities in our region were the levels pre-pandemic that the local authorities there were rightly proud of. And it didn't mean their public transport systems were irrelevant or should be put on the back burner or ignored. Clearly, there's a lot of change coming, but we've got to hold on to those real strong principles about sustainable modes of travel if we're going to come out of this successfully with the next challenges that are on our doorstep from decarbonisation needs. And the last thing I would say is, Alex talked about public transport confidence is absolutely right, and some of that is going to be in maintaining the confidence that the system is going to be there for people, that it's going to adjust to people, and it's going to deliver new solutions for people. And if there's too much talk, and as Lynn mentioned, absolutely negative messaging coming through, how can we expect confidence to grow against that kind of backdrop? So we do need to focus on transport's really positive role to take us forward into the future. And some of those changes to our cities and on the way we work, we don't have to accept that it's all or nothing. We can. People do want to connect. People do want to do some retail in the way they used to do in the past. We can't do a King Canute thing and hold it all back. But equally, we shouldn't assume everything is out the window. And our towns and cities need public transport, and public transport needs towns and cities. And there are really valuable, vital things that come from strong centres that we shouldn't forget, and we need to fight for those too.
Thank you, Martin. And I think it is very clear that the messages we're sending forward, there are as many opportunities as there are problems. So let's concentrate on the positive. Mark, do you want to start, or do you want to go straight to Stephen?
No, I'll start, and then I'll leave Stephen to come in and pick up any technical issues that he feels are there. I'll rattle through some of the points. A lot of useful information, a lot of useful points there, but I'll rattle through these as quickly as I can. On the citizens' assembly point, I don't think TFSE is really in a position to mount a citizens' assembly across the whole of the southeast. But we would, I think, be willing to come along if there were local citizens' assemblies being undertaken, and input the findings of this work into those. On Councillor Stagg's point about the government's forthcoming public transport campaign, not aware of that and what it's likely to say, but I think our bigger point to government is about the need to keep the subsidy that's currently going into public transport, to keep it where it is, that must be maintained through the pandemic. We need a strong public transport offer on the other side of the pandemic. Shift to public transport is key to the delivery of our strategy, and so the initiatives that are in place to support the public transport sector need to continue until we're outside of the other pandemic and possibly beyond. But what we are clear about, I think, is that there's the need to, as a number of points raised about the type of offer that's there. Is there a need to reimagine the public transport offer to some degree? And we've heard that the need to review the way in which the train services operate in our geography, but also some of the things that have come through the pandemic about people wanting more flexible season tickets, a bit more of a demand responsive service rather than timetabled scheduled services. So I think moving forward, and particularly with the bus strategy, which I understand is due in the spring, and maybe Carly from the DFT might be able to update us there, but an opportunity to maybe look at the way bus services work as part of a more integrated transport system. On Councillor Page's points about the planning, we have to be a bit careful here. We're not a planning authority, but I think we've made the point strongly, and certainly the theme of our conference last year was about the need for more integrated land use and transport planning, and I think that the pandemic has highlighted even more so the need for that to as we move forward. A note of caution, I think, on some of the points that were being made about should we be revisiting some of our business cases. I think there's a risk here that if we started that activity too soon, until we're clear about what the longer term trends are here, how we recover from the pandemic, we're in danger of a bit of a start-stop situation. I think we need further evidence and further data, and we need to see how we recover from the pandemic until we initiate some sort of the reviews which are potentially needed as some of the business cases for the larger scale investments within our geography. We need better evidence on which to base those reviews. Otherwise, we'll be stopping and starting, and that's not good for the supply chain. A good point made about Alex about what happens next. And I think we've got further conversations through our technical working groups to sort of see what our constituent authorities more work they would like specifically in this area moving forward. On Councillor Kemp's point about geographic sort of specificity, what's happening in particular areas, answer to that is our analysis doesn't really allow us to sort of dig down into that level of detail. The Sealand model is not sort of that sensitive to particular geographical impacts. So I think hopefully I've covered the majority of the points that were raised there. I don't know if Stephen, if there's anything quickly you wanted to come back on any of the technical points.
I think that's covered them, Mark. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we can drill down into geographical locations, but the more point specific we get, I think the less reliable the modelled outputs would become. And I think also aviation, it's not just about the travel demand, it's also about it as an economic or industrial sector as well. So I think there are complexities to aviation that would make it challenged to look at how the demand for travel to airports, both from a passenger perspective, but also from an employment perspective, and also as a wider kind of economic hub, would be quite challenging, but important to look at nonetheless.
Thank you. And Mark, I draw your attention, I'm sure you've seen it, to the points raised in the chat column as well. So if we can pick those up, because I think if the conclusion of this, and it's not the conclusion, but as a statement now, all of these points need to be taken forward into the area studies and seen to be able to adapt what it is we're looking for. So I'm sure there's a lot more that needs to be put there, and I would suggest that if anyone has got further points outside of this meeting, if they write to you, Mark, drop a line to you.
Absolutely. Yep.
We can include it as we go forward, because we really do need to include what we can. And Carly, sorry, I see you put something in there. We're just expecting the bus strategy. Do you want to say something now or later?
No, I was just responding to Mark's point. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for really good discussion there. And just if there's anything you think about after this, just feed it into Mark, because it's a very useful point. And I think the other bit that we need to give some further thought about was how wide do we share this? Because actually there is an awful lot of information in there that other people would benefit from. And I think we can have another discussion outside of this meeting on where that goes, if that's okay.
Just quickly on that, and Russell can maybe cover off in his comms piece that we have to undertake some work on the final report. You've got a sort of a Word version in your appendix. We are going to issue something which is a bit more, shall we say, coffee table like, to enable us to sort of publicise the work and distribute it more widely. So Russell has done some good work to make it look a bit more pretty.
Well done. Well, thank you all for that. Conscious of time, Shall we move on to agenda item 7? And Rupert, are you going to introduce?
Yeah, thank you, Keith. Just to say a few things. That firstly, to welcome Milan and Tiff to the team. As board members will recall, we were successful with the DFT into securing some further funding to help us with our transport strategy, and that's enabled us to recruit Milan and Tiff on a fixed-term contract. And I have no doubt that you'll see more of them over the next 12 months or so. We've just achieved a huge amount in 2020, and I think, you know, when you look back to our first meeting in July 2017, you know, the fact we have a transport strategy completed, landed with the Department for Transport and the Minister with responsibility for STB saying that they will consider that transport strategy in terms of setting policy and investment decisions. I think just shows how far we've come. Coupled with the further funding from the DFT of 1.225 million that's enabled us to progress work on the area studies is a hugely, I think, successful achievement. And you'll hear more about the area studies progress after this agenda item. I suppose it would be remiss of me not to say that, of course, we were disappointed with the progress on our proposal. However, those area studies lead us to a strategic investment plan, and we know in order to implement that investment plan that we will need some tools to help us do so. And, you know, there'll be a further conversation about that, and Rachel will pick that up a bit later on the agenda. Stakeholder engagement has continued apace, and we've done a huge amount between the team, both with board members, local authorities, MPs, and, you know, I myself have presented on Highways UK and Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation. So, you know, the word of Transport for the South East is not just reaching throughout our region, but it's also having impact nationally. And in fact, our work with the 6 other STBs across the country, I think, is really quite important. You know, you effectively get to the point where each STB has a transport strategy. Join the dots on that, and you have a national transport strategy for government, which I think is hugely helpful in helping support the government's ambition around decarbonisation and public transport improvements and so on. I've got to stress, all of this couldn't be achieved without the fantastic support from your officers, board member officers throughout the constituent authorities. That's both local authorities and LEPs, and also the work of the Transport Forum has been hugely helpful in helping us shape. And then finally, Chairman, just to thank the board members for their continued commitment and support to Transport for the South East. Again, you know, without that, it would make our task even more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure we would all concur with that. And as I say so many times before, that it is the partnership, it is the working across the area that's making the real difference. So keep that going. Are there any questions for Rupert? I haven't got any hands up. Michael.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, whilst its financial support to date is very much appreciated, we still require we still require a funding stream this year and beyond for us to be able to complete the area studies leading to the strategic investment plan. Can we be assured that there won't be any let up in the resolve to push for a regular funding stream into the future, please?
I can give that, but Rupert, do you want to go?
Well, just to give, I mean, absolutely, Michael, spot on. You know, you'll recall from previous board meetings that we set out our ambition in what we hoped was going to be a 3-year spending review. The government decided just to postpone that. Our ambition is to seek core funding, and you know, colleagues will know that you know, Transport for the North and Midlands Connect have benefited from that core funding from the previous spending review. We think we are worthy of that, and those conversations with the DFT are ongoing, and absolutely there's a commitment from us to continue that work. And I think, I mean, it might be a question you wish to ask Carly, Keith, but I think we've got traction with the department, and they understand very clearly what our ambitions are.
Thank you.
Carly, would you like to say anything now or later? Thank you.
I guess I can say now that we're really happy with the working relationship that we have with Rupert and his team, and I think ministers are confident, reassured, comfortable with the work that Transport for the South East are doing, and are sort of pleased to see you continue doing it.
Thank you, and I'm sure that the funding will follow with any certainty as soon as is possible. So
yes, and I really hope I can give you that certainty next month.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. So and that's good news. And again, we appreciate the work that the DFT are doing with us, because again, I had a discussion elsewhere yesterday about whether we concoct these things on our own and present them to government, or whether we work with government to try and deliver. And I think the relationship there is really one that we should be pleased of. So thank you for that. So we'll move on now, if there are no other questions, to area studies, agenda item 8. And Sarah, you're going to introduce, please.
Thank you, Councillor Glazier. Good afternoon, everybody. The purpose of this report is just to provide you with an update on progress with the area study programme. Members will recall that the area study programme translates our transport strategy that was published last year into our vision for the future. It sets out we'll set out the where, the when and the what basically needs to happen in order that we reach that vision for 2050. There's a programme of 5 studies covering different parts of the geography, 2 of them orbital, 3 of them radial, and they are being managed together as an overall programme so that we can really make sure we understand the interrelationships where those areas overlap. And the outer orbital study commenced late last summer, and work is progressing really well with it. The evidence-based part of the work is virtually complete now, and that very much set out the aims and objectives of the study. We've also commenced work on the next stage of work, which is looking at option generation and assessment, so looking very much into the forms of interventions that could provide the solutions to those aims and objectives. Throughout the development of this study so far, stakeholder engagement has been embedded throughout. We have an area study working group comprising members of our local transport authorities, and also a wider forum including more of our broader stakeholders. The working group, the officers who sit on that group, we meet monthly, and they've been very involved in the detail of the technical work that's been going on so far. And the wider stakeholder group has met twice, looking at feeding into key points within the study. I'm really happy with the engagement and really value everybody's time in helping us. The timescales for this particular study have been extended slightly. We've found that it would be really beneficial to carry out a bit more analysis on some of the data that sits behind the work that we're doing, and we've taken the time to do that. As we've done it, we've also done it for the other 4 studies that will come along as well, so that those are in a better place when they get to that stage. That does mean that the timescale for this particular study has been extended, but it doesn't have an effect on the overall programme, because this is, of course, the first one out of the 5. In relation to the other studies, the inner orbital and the south central radial study have also mobilised just shortly before Christmas, and they're now getting really into the evidence-based part of that work. The various stakeholder groups, the officers from our constituent authorities and the wider forum have been set up. The officer groups met once so far, and the wider forum meets for the first time at the beginning of February. In relation to the last 2 studies, and just referring back to Councillor Payne's point, the Southwest and the Southeast radial studies, they are currently planned to start next financial year, but that is of course dependent on funding confirmation from the Department for Transport. A revised programme just showing that extended duration for the outer orbital study is included in the agenda pack, Appendix B. And members are recommended to note the progress with the area studies, and future updates will be continued to be provided at future meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Are there any questions for Sarah? None showing. Well, thank you. Roger.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Sarah, for her updates. I just wanted to highlight that in those studies that full account is taken of rural transport, and we've touched on that sort of the potential changes as outlined in the earlier report with regard to COVID. And whilst obviously those issues and potential solutions will be identified by the local transport plans, I think it is important that we get a strong view from TFSE, and also that with that it can go forward to government to see the importance of addressing the challenges there are with regard to maintaining rural transport, if in fact we're not going to rely solely on the car. Thank you. I wonder if Sarah had a comment on that.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you want to make your point and then Sarah can pick both of them up?
Yes, I'm just wanted to strongly support what Roger just said then. Absolutely, rural transport is so important. We would like that as an area to be looked at. Thank you.
Okay. Rupert, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I mean, the rural transport element is important, and we had a good debate at the Transport Forum, which no doubt Jeff will pick up on earlier on. I think, clearly for rural transport, it's a lot of local transportation matters that, I wouldn't want to take the responsibility away from the local transport authorities, who are absolutely fundamental in ensuring that rural connectivity. Clearly we have a role to play, and we'll support as best we can in that sort of rural transport debate. And I think, the area studies are developed in such a way that it does allow you to take account of the interdependencies between the strategic corridors and rural hinterland, market towns, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. I think Rupert's answered it, Sarah, but is there anything you want to add? Michael wants to come in as well in a moment, but Michael?
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, I think Rupert said more or less what I was going to say, because rural transport moving forward, absolutely vital. I agree entirely, but surely, it is embedded in the studies that we're doing. That's the whole purpose for the area studies, and indeed, as Rupert has said, also by the work of the local authorities. So I would be minded that, we wouldn't want to see duplication in, certainly at this stage, until the area studies are completed anyway.
Great, I would agree with that.
Sarah, is there anything you want to add, or you just noted?
I don't think so. I think Rupert covered it quite nicely. Thank you.
Right. So we're asked to note the progress on the area studies and work with them, and very much hope that we can continue with the final two. So we move to agenda item 9, which is the technical programme update. And Rob, I think you're going to do that, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So this report is just to provide you with an update on the various elements of the technical work programme. So that includes the progress update on the development of a future mobility strategy, as well as an update on the process to secure a consultant to develop the freight logistics and gateway strategy, which you may remember from the last meeting as well. And the report concludes with just the conclusion of the carbon emissions assessment work, which was undertaken to understand the potential impact of interventions identified as part of the area studies on carbon emissions and our trajectory towards net zero. So just taking each of those in turn, the future mobility strategy, as you remember, the work was awarded to WSP in partnership with STEER back in March 2020. It comprises 4 tasks, the first 2 of which are now complete. The second 2, which is the future mobility strategy development and the action plan development, are still in progress. Just to let you know that there's been some additional work which we've encompassed within this, particularly just bearing in mind Councillor Elkins and Councillor Payne's and Vanessa's comments just now around rural mobility, to look at what some of those interventions in rural areas could look like. And in particular, not just single interventions, but packages of interventions, which can then feed through into the area studies. So just to provide some reassurance, we're also looking at the rural mobility issue as part of the future mobility strategy as well. As you know, the strategy is being overseen by the Future Mobility Steering Group, which is formed of key stakeholders, both from the public and private sector. with an interest in this particular area of work. The last meeting was held on the 19th of November. We've actually got one now coming up on the 9th of February, where we're going to be talking about some of these particular interventions, etc., which will be coming through. And also, again, just to make the link with the private sector, we're pleased to see that Brighton Hove Buses is coming along to talk about their hydrogen ambitions at that meeting as well. So we're trying to encompass, you know, a broad spectrum of different elements of future mobility in these pieces of work. So we've been obviously providing updates to the Transport Strategy Working Group as well, giving them technical updates. And at the moment, we're expecting the Future Mobility Strategy to be completed in April of this year. So in due course, obviously, that will come before the board, and we will update you on that at the April meeting. Just moving on to the Freight Logistics and Gateway Strategy. So I came to the last meeting and updated you on the procurement process for that. We were just about to embark on, and we actually sent out the request for quote in November, and we had 3 submissions in December for that piece of work. And I'm pleased to say that we have now secured a provider, which is actually a consortium of WSP, Steer, and a company called Future City Logistics, to undertake that piece of work for us. So we've undertaken, we've had the inception meeting, and we're now getting started, particularly exploring the stakeholder requirements of this particular piece of work, because this is going to be absolutely fundamental for the freight strategy. So there will be a freight steering group overseeing the development of strategy, as well as a freight forum formed of wider stakeholder interests as well. So we're starting that work in earnest now, and obviously I will bring back a report to you at the April 21 meeting on that one. And just finally, to conclude on the carbon emissions assessment work, you may remember we brought this to you back in October, and there's a number of different parts of this work which I won't go through now, bearing in mind the time, but it's actually included in the report. And just to let you know that report has now concluded. We did hold a meeting with DFT to discuss that, after which there were some minor changes required, but that's now been presented to the Transport Strategy Working Group, and that will go on to inform the development of the area studies, which is obviously the purpose of that report anyway. So that's for members. That's really the progress of the technical work programme to date, and yeah, the recommendations to note the progress on the development of that future mobility strategy, also on the freight logistics and gateway strategy, and the conclusion of the carbon emissions assessment work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rob. Vanessa, is that an old hand, or have you got a question on this one?
Old hands.
Thank you, but you're welcome. Are there any questions for Rob, or any other points that people want to make on this agenda item? Okay, none. So we've just been asked to note the progress of the development of the future mobility strategy. You've got it on your screen, I'm sure. Note the progress of securing consultant to develop the freight and logistics gateway strategy, and note the conclusion of the carbon emissions assessment. Are we happy to do that? I'll take no as a yes. Thank you. Well done. We'll move on to agenda item 10, which is the MRN and the LLM scheme update. And again, Sarah, please.
Thank you, Councillor Glazier. Yes, this report is just to provide an update on some sort of recent announcements with the MRN and LLM scheme programmes. Members, I'm sure, will recall that previously in summer of 2019, they agreed a list of priority schemes for those 2 programmes that we then subsequently submitted to government. Since then, Department for Transport officials have been working away assessing the schemes, and 3 of our schemes have been approved to move from a pre-SOVC stage to ask them to develop their strategic outline business cases. There haven't actually been any more recent announcements than that, but I am aware through my constant liaison with officers that good progress is being made by the scheme promoters and DFT in developing these schemes. In the 2018 budget, the Treasury confirmed the creation of the National Roads Fund, and this hypothecated vehicle excise duty to road spending. The major road network and large local major scheme programmes were, and also the Roads Investment Strategy for Highways England, were due to be funded from this National Roads Fund. Shortly before Christmas last year, and there was a few articles in the media referring to there being no mention of the major road network and large local major programmes in the spending review. DfT then therefore subsequently sent out an email confirming their position on those programmes, and the text of that email is included within the report. It's very clear from the email that DfT do remain committed to the MRN and large local major programmes and schemes, but the one-year settlement means that the approval process they previously envisaged will have to change, and it's now going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. It's also understood that DfT will have to bid for funding on a competitive basis for the large local major and major road network programmes. And so it's increasingly important that our scheme promoters continue to work closely with DfT officials in both in developing their business cases, but also in keeping the DfT up to date on progress with their schemes, so that the DfT are in a position to have the evidence they need to make those bids for funding. The scheme promoters from all our constituent authorities have been kept up to date. I've been forwarding on the emails that we've been receiving from DfT, so they should all be aware, but we just thought it was worth making the board aware as well of that. Subsequent to those conversations, there were a few questions raised from our scheme promoters regarding development funding. So this was funding that the DfT indicated they would be able to provide for schemes that had been approved at strategic outline business case stage in order to develop their outline business cases. The DfT have subsequently confirmed they are still intending to provide that funding, so that should give, again, our authorities comfort in developing their schemes that there is that development funding still available. Members are just recommended to note that that is the case, that we've had this correspondence with DfT, but that DfT do remain committed to the major road network and large local major schemes, and therefore promoters should absolutely continue to work closely with DfT in developing those schemes.
Thank you, Sarah. Are there any questions for Sarah? Vanessa?
Yes, thank you. Sarah, do you know if the promoting authorities, is everybody re-looking at their business cases now because of the pandemic and the actual Brexit realities that we've got? Because surely, just as we've just been talking about earlier this afternoon, things are changing. The business cases must be changed. Thank you.
Alice, do you want to come in as well?
Thank you. Just a quick plea, actually. We've had quite a few cases come in and across elsewhere across the country where they are submitting OBC business cases to Department for Transport, and Department for Transport ask Highways England for any input to their consideration. We've had quite a few examples recently, as I say, elsewhere in the country, but I just want to apply it to your area, where Highways England is not being engaged by local authorities on schemes that are, might have some impact on the SRN. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to raise a plea to local authorities where you are developing the OBC cases to make sure you do engage with Highways England in sufficient time to allow us to consider and support that application, because we are being asked by DfT for that advice. So sorry, I just want to take that opportunity.
Thank you. Very good advice. I'm sure that's noted. Roger. I can't see you.
The unmute button, Chair. Well, I think it's been highlighted, and I think all local authorities are aware of the challenge that puts us forward in the sort of one-year settlement going forward. And I think it's been emphasised the fact that TFSE, need to continue to make the case for the importance of this major road network and the investment in that. And I think that is key, because otherwise local authorities will not be able to plan where they're investing going forward. So I'm pleased for that, but we need to keep on promoting the case to government on that, and I'm pleased to hear the comments in relation to that.
Thank you, Roger. Rupert, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Just on Vanessa's point, I might have misunderstood you, but in relation to the MRN and LLM schemes, a number of those are about how you support things like housing growth, regeneration, as well as supporting place-based development and putting that emphasis back onto to people and place. I mean, undoubtedly your point about which I think I've got is about how businesses are being challenged by some of the new arrangements. Certainly that is the case, but our expectation, the evidence that we're seeing at the moment, is that they are getting to grips with that, and certainly the movement of goods and services through key ports, like notwithstanding the issues around containers, but Southampton, Portsmouth, Dover, Folkestone, will continue, and the network needs to be able to deal with those kinds of movements, as well as provide those opportunities to create place and new communities.
Thank you. Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add?
I think I'd just probably refer back to it's the same sort of point that Mark made earlier about the COVID response and the work there that Alex made from London on that, in terms of re-looking at business cases. Yeah, no, not currently the plan to do so. Obviously looking at how things will change and its long term, what will the new normal be. So not specifically, but as Rupert alluded to, there's many other reasons why the schemes are going ahead, not just on the basis of the sort of peak hour travel.
Okay, we don't really have any more questions. So we're asked to note the DfT position statement regarding the major roads network and the large local major programs. Are we happy to do that? Yeah, I take that we are. My concern now is whether Adam is with us or not. I can't see on my screen. Is Adam here?
I am, Councillor. Hi, Chair. Hello.
Well done. Thank you. So can we return now to your presentation, please, on from Highways England?
Very happy to. Russell, would you like me to share my screen?
Please do. Hopefully I've unshared mine, so you should be looking at your grid of faces. So yeah, you please take the wheel.
No problem. Can I just check, is that sharing for you?
That's displaying as it should do in presentation mode. Thanks, Adam.
Good. I will. I'll say what slide I'm on. Do shout if for whatever reason it's not updating. Because I'm in presentation mode, I'm afraid I can't see hands up. So I'll go through the presentation. If anyone does have anything urgent to jump in, by all means, just shout. Otherwise, very happy to take questions at the end. So to introduce myself, I'm Adam Simmons. I'm our Director of Future Road Investment Strategies and Government Relations in Highways England. The presentation today, I did want to take you through the main messages, the main highlights in the second road investment strategy, and what we've set out as Highways England in our delivery plan, our strategic business plan. I'm quite conscious that these are documents now that have been published for a few months. So I will try and give a little bit of a flavour or rationale behind them, and as I say, very happy to take questions at the end. So this first slide says here, we absolutely recognise the importance of the motorways and A roads, major A roads in England. Obviously carrying all traffic, but particularly freight. And we recognise that government sort of recognises the importance of that. I think there'll be no surprise to those assembled here today. And just sort of, I suppose, looking back to where the position we were in coming into the second road period, since we were formed as a company in 2015, we have been given obviously targets around improving safety, and we've been in line with those targets. As a company, we've been asked to think about being more customer focused, so we've really thought about how we capture and respond to those customer needs, obviously drawing from Transport Focus and the like to understand that customer picture. Another important part of the first road period and why Highways England was set up was to deliver efficiencies. We've exceeded that target, and as you'll see for RIS2, we've been given another very challenging target, which which we're embracing. It's worth repeating that investment in roads, I think, still has a good return on the economy. Again, I don't think there will be any surprises there for you. And that last point just on here about our neighbours, again, really thinking about not only delivery for our immediate customers, but that wider impact on the environment, on our neighbours. I know this is looking back at RIS1, and I'll be talking about RIS2, but I think that theme of building by consent is incredibly important for roads. And we know now, see the growing agenda around carbon and so on is absolutely important, and one that we need to embrace. And I think we have done in RIS2, and looking ahead to RIS3, we will continue to do that. I'll sort of run through these. I mean, the A14 scheme, I think, is an example that gets rolled out quite often about, a big, over £1 billion investment that has been delivered on time, on budget. I think some really good things about how it's constructed, how it's thought about, not just motorised transport, but non-motorised transport, what it does for safety. I think for me, going forward is then how we take those lessons and roll that out on a wider basis, almost in an industrialization of that. Certainly, that's our ambition to learn those lessons and take them on into projects in Road Period 2, and from my perspective, again, continue to do so into RIS3. And there was a place where there was a lot of innovation used on the A14. This picture here of the self-propelled modular transporter to install bridge decks, tools that we can use to minimise the impact on on the network, do things quicker, more efficiently. It's great to see them in the A14. We want to start to see these in other projects as well. And then a similar sort of story around the Albury Viaduct. I think a lot of good lessons that were learned from here, again, about what to do around big concrete renewals programme, the other things that were done at the same time. But again, I think how we take those lessons into the current road period, and also how and one of the themes about RIS2, how we think about our renewals programme. I think that's been one of the successes of the road investment strategy for 2020 to 2025. So, onto that period. In case you're not familiar, two key documents from us as Highways England, the Strategic Business Plan and the Delivery Plan. And I think, whereas maybe the first road period was around setting up Highways England as a company, showing how 5-year investment can work, give that certainty to the supply chain, enable that slightly longer term planning than annual investments. I think in RIS2, it was then about stepping up, obviously building on those successes of RIS1, but sort of doing more really across the piece. These are our key performance indicator sort of outcome areas. And I just really wanted to take you through the different areas of investment and say a little bit about those. I'm going to start here with obviously very significant investment made in operations, maintenance and renewals. For us as Highways England, this was something we really pushed quite hard and make the case very strongly to government. And to be fair, government absolutely recognised the need to think about the existing network and the existing assets as much as new investments. So, obviously in the operations and maintenance space, how we send our traffic officers out to manage incidents, our control room, supporting our customers during their journeys. But a significant investment in big major renewals across all our assets, but in this road period, particularly focusing on concrete pavement, the sort of crash barriers, the vehicle restraint systems and large structures. Looking ahead then to the enhancements, you know, a big investment here again, I think very much backing up the view that you know, the infrastructure capital investment can play a really important role in supporting the economy, very directly leading to and supporting. Well, we've got a figure here of 64,000 construction jobs. I think that's quite a conservative estimate, but you know, directly leading to jobs, but having that wider support in the economy. I think one thing I would say here is that you know, many of these schemes, the 69 schemes there, were committed to in the first RIS. I think right that they were seen through, continuing to look at value for money of them, and some schemes were effectively dropped if they weren't offering that value for money as they were reviewed. But seeing through that commitment that was made in the first RIS, and those 12 new schemes actually very much around the not exclusively, but very much around the smart motorways stock take and thinking about converting dynamic hard shoulder to all lane running. I know this isn't a discussion about RIS 3, but I think there's a slightly different feel as we look ahead. There's sort of less of that rolling forward of road period into another, although of course there is some of that. Construction obviously doesn't fit neatly into 5-year chunks, but I think there's a bit less of that latency of a lot of commitments that were made earlier on. So, you know, I think that puts a different slant on how we're taking things forward. I just highlighted a specific scheme here, you know, the A66 Transpennine. You know, actually it was something that was raised in the recent spending review about trying to do this a bit more quickly. You know, a big sort of scheme there, obviously with a lot of important impacts. Similarly with the Lower Thames crossing here, seeing that commitment through, putting that investment in, a lot of discussion with government about getting the right level of investment, thinking about managing the risk that is inherent in such a major sort of complex infrastructure project, and then the same for the commitment around the A303 works near Stonehenge. Keeping on, one of the things we learned, and you know, government I think very much heard from the first road investment strategy, was the success of the designated funds. So I think actually a step up in investment here, and a way of trying to rationalise and simplify the funds. So still doing a broad range of smaller investments, you know, innovative investments or investments that are required more across looking at the network in a national way. But whether that's looking at safety and congestion, so thinking about particular sort of hotspots on the network and trying to respond to that, thinking about innovation around, you know, users and communities, you know, particularly, you know, things like kind of freight parking, coach parking, and sort of particularly that interaction between the environment and well-being. In part, that's driven by obviously kind of creative and innovative things, but also that's the way in which we manage a number of our environmental key performance indicators, for example, around biodiversity and ensuring we achieve no net loss of biodiversity across our network, sort of find managing on that way, on top of specific project interventions is a good way to do it. And then the innovation and modernisation funds, you know, how we support trials and things like that. I think this will be increasingly important as we look ahead to, you know, thinking about the technologies that will drive the zero carbon agenda. So, you know, good to see again that commitment to the designated funds there, because they can be quite targeted in smaller ways that we don't necessarily pick up through the big enhancements or the renewals works. I think, as I mentioned before, we had a challenging efficiency target in the first road period, which we exceeded. We are being asked to find over £2.2 billion of efficiencies in this current road period, and the way that's being done is those efficiencies need to be met for us to fully fund the work that's being done. So it's about doing more work within a constrained envelope, and there are different ways in which we're delivering those efficiencies. I do think one of the big themes of the next 5 years will be particularly how we do partnership working with the supply chain, either through formal frameworks or through sort of more traditional frameworks. And again, particularly how we look not just our own network, but that interface with either the local road networks or the other transport networks around us. We have key performance indicators, as you expect. We have 12 of those, but on top of that, we do have PIs and a number of specific commitments that are set out in our strategic business plan. A lot of these do roll forward from the first road period, which I think is a good thing. It's about that continuing to build and improve level of service to our customers over successive road periods. Some of these are a slightly different articulation of metrics, but achieving similar sorts of things. But this is reflecting what we're hearing from our customers as being the important things that we should be focusing on. I'll say a little bit about areas that are particularly being taken forward in this road period. Digital roads is something we've been thinking about for a little while, but started talking about a bit more publicly, for example, in the recent Highways UK conference. And that's thinking about how we use our data, of which I think we have a lot of data and a lot of quite unique data, to support our own construction and doing that as efficiently as possible, our own operations, and again unlocking efficiencies and productivities there, but also how we're providing data to help our customers inform their journeys. And it is very much about data provision rather than sort of trying to create I think there's some sort of animation to automatically advance slides, so I'm having to click back sometimes. But yes, for our customers, thinking about the data that we provide to them to help them with their journeys, and I think we'll start to see more of that coming forward over this road period. Carbon, of course, extremely important outcome for us to focus on. I think for a while now, Highways England has taken a number of actions and steps within managing our carbon. Obviously, a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion with government about making sure the overall investment over the 5-year period fits with the government's agenda and trajectory to achieve net zero carbon by 2050. So doing a lot of things there. What this graphic just sets out is that we'll be thinking about, we'll be publishing a net zero carbon strategy shortly, actually in spring this year, that thinks about the carbon that we emit directly and how we get that to net zero, so our so-called corporate carbon, our construction and maintenance carbon. So I suppose what's generated by our work, but ultimately comes through our supply chain that acts on our behalf. So needing to work with our supply chain on getting that to net zero carbon, sorry. And then, but we recognise that the majority of carbon comes from the tailpipe, and we want to play our part in supporting government in the rollout of electric vehicles. I think there are some functions and roles for us to be done on in terms of supporting charging of electric cars and electric vans. And we've sort of been supporting some of the local van centres in electric. But I think there's a really big role for us to play in how we help enabling zero carbon options for HGVs, where perhaps electric's not the answer. We have to think about hydrogen or catenary systems, and I think Highways England can play a really important role in helping to trial that and unlock that. But very much see our function as enabling our customers who choose, and government who are sort of pushing the electric vehicles agenda to use our network. I will stop there. That's on our website. You can have a look at our strategic business plan and delivery plan. I do think they're quite well written. I think, to be fair, government's RIS is quite well written as well. So if you haven't had a look, please do. And probably with that, I will stop sharing my screen so I can see hands up and so on. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Adam. If we start with Michael, followed by Steve, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Very useful update. I'd just like to explore a little further thinking between the linkage between RIS2 and its potential successor RIS3, if that is to be its title in due course. And I'm thinking not necessarily of new schemes per se, but those that are required already and really critical to delivery of existing benefits. In other words, schemes that are already in train at the planning stage, and what sort of degree of certainty is there around their delivery in the RIS3 period? And I make no apology as Cabinet Member for Highways and Transport in Kent in relating to matters over and above Lower Thames Crossing. For instance, down the M2A2 corridor, we have priorities at Brenley Corner and the dualling of Lyddon, because this is a critical link from and between Dover and the north, and to get the full benefit of Lower Thames Crossing, if it should come to fruition, those two elements are needed as well. Can you give us any reassurance as to how such schemes, not specifically just those two, will be linked into RIS3?
Yes, of course. I think there's probably two things to say there. Certainly, where there is, obviously those bigger schemes like Lower Thames Crossing. As part of that work, the team looks at some of those so-called wider network benefits and thinks about what other investments may need to be required to support that. I confess I don't know exactly where we are in that particular sort of area, but I know that's absolutely part of the thinking, part of the development of the project. In terms of identifying need across the whole network feeding into RIS3, a really important part of that will be through our what's called route strategies. So that's part of the statutory process. Highways England is required to look across the whole network, think about the needs across the network that then informs government in their decision making about what priorities to take forward. And I know I said two, so without turning this into the Spanish Inquisition sketch, that's probably the third thing to say, which is government in announcing the RIS did say that they wanted Highways England to look at 32 schemes in particular, so-called pipeline schemes, without commitment to say that they would definitely go forward, but sort of take those through the earlier stages of planning and development, or sorry, earlier stages of development, so they can inform government's thinking. So there was some schemes there that that had been taken forward that could, if so chosen, be started. So that was set out in government's RIS2 document. So in terms of actual commitments, of course, that is down to the Secretary of State ultimately taking a decision about what investments, what enhancements to include in the next road investment strategy. But there is those steps by which we look at the needs across the network that in turn informs and feeds into that process with government.
Thank you. We've got 4 hands up at the moment, Steve. If I take a few questions, then you answer them all in one go, just to try to speed things up a bit. We've got Steve and Jeff, followed by Roger and Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Adam, for the presentation. Mine's a very quick one. You talked about the route to net zero, and you talked really importantly identifying the supply chain. Here at Southampton, I'm the Cabinet Member, but with transport in my portfolio, we work with our supply chain in this area. I just wanted to ask whether you also adopt principles of social value, or you look at social value in your supply chain as well. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Very, very good question. So, yes, I think looking at social value is actually something that we've always done in looking at investments. But I see that a bit like carbon. Again, we've always looked at that, but I see that very much rising up. How government wants to have the evidence to inform certain investments and decisions. So I know on that side, looking at quite broad social value, but thinking about jobs, skills, investment, the impact on the environment and so on is absolutely part of that. And I've had a few conversations with our chief analyst about exactly how we do that, and obviously with the Department for Transport as well. So yeah, social value, definitely I think an important part of the evidence that will inform decision making.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. I just wanted to emphasise the issue around zero carbon, which sort of came in very late in your presentation, and not quite as an afterthought. That would be unfair, but actually we are building up issues, as came up at the last Transport Forum meeting, which I chair. We're building up issues already. I mean, people are still buying vehicle cars that are driven by petrol or diesel, and those cars are going to be in use for very many years. And I just feel that there's not enough urgency about how we're addressing it and how we are trying to perhaps use the current situation as a catalyst to encourage change.
It's an excellent question, and I think certainly they're kind of part of the thinking and informed the investment for RIS2. I think that sort of increased urgency that you mentioned, I think is absolutely right, and that's why we want to pull together into one place all the things we have been doing, but then actually the things we can then do next, be that to support this uptake of electric vehicles that the government's very much driving, but also how we make the most of our existing network, how we can construct in a zero carbon way, which might be trialing different materials, which might be obviously thinking about how we decarbonize steel and concrete. We know that's very difficult without carbon capture, but also using things, trialing things like glulam, sort of the laminated timber technology on certain things, or what did I see was being added to our catalogue of sort of tools that we can use, effectively a sort of recycled tyres that avoids the need of using asphalt that perhaps could be used in emergency areas. So I think there's no one thing in this area. It's a whole drive, and because actually I have responsibility for developing our net zero carbon strategy. What we want to do is sort of have that as something that underpins all of our decision making across the company, across our supply chain. That means sort of carbon's at the heart of all our decisions, and that need not be more expensive. In fact, it could drive cost efficiencies as well as achieving our carbon outcomes. But I think in the way that in our first road period, we had a real focus on safety as a company. That was our primary imperative, and it really informed all our decision making. I can see carbon as being in that same space, sort of having it there in the front of mind, that is thinking about doing things differently, using different materials and so on, that actually really makes that change, so we can not only hit the 2050 target, but sort of hit some really important milestones along the way around our corporate carbon and our construction and maintenance carbon, as well as then obviously playing our part with the road user tailpipe carbon agenda.
Thank you, Adam. Roger, and then Vanessa, please.
Thank you, Keith. Would it be possible to have a copy of the slides, your slides circulated? And that would be...
Yes, of course. I think Russell does have them, but I'll make sure offline that we've got that.
And I think I need to reflect.
We'll make sure they're added. We'll make sure they're added to a follow-up email that includes any other materials from today.
Thank you very much. And I'm just conscious of commitments going forward to RIS3, I think, and I think we need to reflect on that. Obviously, where we have schemes that may be being worked up on RIS2, where we go with the commitment of that. And I note your comments that Michael made reference to earlier in the discussion, that where we have schemes that are on important strategic networks, are we intended to get the continuity of funding going forward? How will that be assessed?
No, understood. And yeah, I think there's that process that I set out sort of lets us make sure we capture those and continue to sort of see what are the, give that evidence to government about those, what the priorities may be and how they take those decisions.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Adam, for your report. One thing I thought was missing from it was just the microplastic pollution that we get from all types of transport, whether we had a fully electrified fleet or not, there's still going to be the pollution from the tyres, the microplastic that then, as surface water runoff is going to be polluting water supplies. And I just wanted to ask if you looked into that and what could be done about that. And maybe shouldn't we be thinking about investment in how we mitigate our existing road network for that? And also, I just fundamentally, like I was pleased to see the carbon net zero that you're trying to kind of target, but how can new road building ever be carbon neutral? How can that ever become that? I just don't get it. That's why I just think strategically investment now should be in the existing network to get that to be as environmentally friendly as possible. And I think there's a huge amount of work to be done there. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably two things to say there. In terms of when I mentioned our net zero carbon strategy being published a little later this year, and I would see that as actually the first, toe in the water. That's not a fire and forget. That's sort of, we'll keep coming back to that. Absolutely, it won't just be carbon. It will look at that broader environmental sustainability. I would have to take away, to be honest, that specific question you raised about the sort of micro sort of plastics from tires and so on. Let me just sort of take that back. I'm not sure exactly where we are with that. I think in terms of how can roads be net zero carbon, I absolutely see that it can be, and new road building can be. I think there's a couple of things to say. I think first, when the fleet is decarbonised, roads, cars, vans, HGVs, obviously then we're not seeing that carbon from the tailpipe allied with decarbonising of the grid to do that. And I think we'll see that roads still need to play a really critical part of a net zero economy. Freight, goods and services, people will still need to be moving across the network. We still probably expect to see traffic to grow. So I do think that there is a way in which one can enhance the network, but in a net zero way. In terms of specifically road building, the Committee on Climate Change said that they expect to see broadly construction, not just road construction, but construction generally, to decarbonise by 2040 as part of government's move to achieving 2050 target overall. And absolutely, we see that. I think there's a pathway to do that. There are absolutely some questions to be answered. I think anyone that says they know exactly how we will get to net zero carbon 2050 or steps along the way with absolute certainty is just not true. It's a collective problem we all need to work through. We can see decarbonising concrete and steel up to a point, but then I think we need to sort of recognise that either alternatives need to be found, and if not, things like carbon capture and storage, which is part of the government's 10-point plan, needs to be put in place. So I'm not saying, today I know exactly how we're going to get there. I think I can say I can see the sorts of interventions we need to do in this road period and probably next, and the sorts of things we need to see on the path to 2050, but it will absolutely require that constant attention and innovation and sort of partnership working that will help us to get there.
Thank you, Adam. Rupert, you wanted the final word?
Yeah, please. Thanks, Keith. It's just, I suppose in part, it's just to give Vanessa some assurances that the transport strategy recognises a very unique nature of the South East, both in terms of its protected and designated areas, but also those constraints that exist around new roads. And a lot of our emphasis is on the focus on those existing corridors. And, what we want to see, and you'll know, being an East Sussex resident, the traditional of the South East is just not fit for purpose. So it's how you improve those corridors. And that, so, I think it aligns with all the points that you've made.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. And thank you, Adam. Very, very good presentation. Thank you. So we've got all the questions we have, and again, if there's any further, we can forward them on. So shall we move on to agenda item 11, which is comms and stakeholder engagement? And Lucy, I think you're going to introduce.
Yep. this one's me. Thank you very much. I will whiz through this quickly. It is an update paper rather than a decision paper, and a lot of this has already been covered. So really, just to reinforce the fact that the new virtual world is working well in our favour in terms of stakeholder engagement, as has already come up in passing today. With such a wide geography, being able to meet like this is actually of tremendous benefit to our stakeholders. And we've noticed a significant improvement both in engagement levels and also in the number of attendees at our meetings. So I'm keen to carry on as we are. Rupert has already mentioned that there continues to be a keen and growing interest in TFSE, regular invitations to the Secretariat to speak at events, which is great, and we take those wherever we can. We've already touched on area study engagement, been a lot of stakeholder work around that, organising the relevant forums and working groups. And as Rob has mentioned, freight is the latest big thing in terms of stakeholder engagement. So currently working on establishing the working steering group for the freight work and also the forum. We do recognise that there is a significant risk now of stakeholder fatigue, particularly amongst our most important key stakeholders, who are being absolutely fantastic in the level of meeting attendance that is going on at the moment. And it is going to be a busy year, there's no denying that. So just to add our thanks from our side of the team, we are very, very grateful for your continued support. Moving on to specific projects, we are continuing our conversations with Kent University around their freight project. That has moved on somewhat, but we are still involved and are there to support them as they carry on and move on with that. Linked to universities, we have our next University Roundtable meeting on the 22nd of February. As always, board members are very welcome to come and join us at that. You haven't been sent calendar invites automatically, but if you would like to attend, please let me know. We have good acceptance rates so far from universities across the region. Towards the end of last year, we undertook some significant targeted engagement with our district and borough colleagues, attended a large number alongside Councillor Glazier of district and borough leaders and chief executives meetings. They were very well received. It was very interesting. It certainly helped to build our network. And I have also personally attended quite a high number of planning and planning policy meetings. So continuing to build links with those colleagues. And that will link with the rollout of our new project view tool, which will be happening within the next couple of months. So watch out for that. Very briefly, a town and parish council interest group has been established, and we now have a seat for the town and parish councils on the Transport Forum. That is following some significant feedback that we received through the Transport Strategy consultation, and also through other colleagues and board members that we should try and form some links. So we have one seat on the Transport Forum taken by a councillor from West Sussex, who is coordinating a further larger group on our behalf. One thing I would like to spend a little bit more time on is MP engagement. We did have some face-to-face targeted engagement with our MPs towards the end of last year again. Very well received, but it is difficult to encourage MPs to attend when they have such very, very busy diaries. So we do recognise very strongly that our opportunities to engage with MPs are golden opportunities, and we have to target it appropriately. For that reason, in relation to the area studies, we have decided to go out with a virtual briefing. So we are going to be contacting all of the MPs directly with a fairly comprehensive briefing pack and various links to information around the area studies and what is fundamentally a questionnaire. So it will be an electronic form that MPs are able to fill in to give their feedback and thoughts around the area study process. The reason I'm mentioning it now is because we propose to send those personalised emails to our MPs in the name of Councillor Glazier, but also to include the board member names on that covering comms that goes with this briefing pack. If anybody has an issue with that, please let me know. But we continue to think that it is very important that certainly our political engagement is led jointly by the TFSE lead and also the local board member. They are due to go out week commencing the 8th of February, so imminently. The final thing to mention, events programme for 2021. We are in the process of developing it. The thing to just make you aware of is that we are working towards a future mobility event in March. That's going to be targeted around our forum members. And the final thing to mention, which has already come up, is the COVID report. Just to say that the tabletop, not such tabletop version, the easy read version that has been worked on by Russell will be shared via all our communications channels and social media. That is a slightly easier to digest version of the report with some nice infographics in there, which you'll be able to share with your colleagues. So that is it. The recommendation of the report is just to note the contents, no decisions, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lucy. Are there any questions or comments for Lucy? No? Well, thank you very much, Lucy. And I think it's clear we've got a very big programme still to deliver, so thank you for that. Moving on to agenda item 12, which is working towards the strategic investment plan. And Rachel, you can do that, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this report is to start looking beyond the area studies which are currently underway at the minute and start to think about the preparation and development of the strategic investment plan. And the paper sets out the areas that we would like board members' input on. The first area to identify is that we are proposing to slightly change the timescale for the development of the strategic investment plan. We've up until now, we've been saying that we would have a final SIP document by April 2022. However, when we've been doing our planning work and our sort of thinking around the SIP, what we've realised is that that actually doesn't give a considerable amount of time for any form of engagement around the final SIP. And it also doesn't offer an opportunity for constituent authorities and other board members to take it through their relevant sign-off processes. So what we are proposing is that a draft SIP is prepared by April 22, and then we start a public consultation exercise following the sign-off of the draft document. Once we've then completed the consultation, we would bring a revised version of the document back to the board in October 2022, and then allow constituent authorities to take it through their relevant sign-off processes, such as councils and cabinets, so that we can say that by the time that we get to January 23, we would have a SIP which has been through the relevant processes. Appendix 1 sets out the new timetable that we're proposing for the route map to the strategic investment plan. And although it does mean that we have to wait longer for the final version of the SIP, we do think that given the importance of the document, it's really critical that we do demonstrate that we've had a full engagement process on it, including a consultation process, and that we've also allowed our constituent authorities to have that buy-in. I think the other thing to say is that also from April 22, we will have a draft that we can work towards. It will come from the area studies where there's been a huge amount of engagement with a range of stakeholders as well. The second part of the report sets out that we should also use the period while we're developing the SIP to think about the tools and the powers that we might need as we move towards the implementation of the SIP and the sort of way that we want Transport for the South East to develop to have those tools. So what we're highlighting there is that we'd like to start a piece of work with the member subgroup to think about what Transport for the South East would need in terms of the tools to deliver the SIP. And then the final part of the report, which is linked to that, is that we are starting a piece of work. We're planning to commission some independent external consultants to consider how Transport for the South East develops in terms of its future role. So at the minute, we are very much focused on the production of the strategy, the area studies and the SIP. But once the SIP's completed and we move into implementation, what role does Transport for the South East adopt following that? So we're going to bring in some independent external advice to look at that. We are intending that they will, whoever we bring in to do that piece of work, will work with board members, with senior officer group and with some of our key stakeholders to do some interviews, gather views on that. And we are intending to bring more of an update back to the April board meeting. So there's 3 recommendations in the report, which board members are asked to agree and note. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Are there any questions or comments on Rachel? No hands rushing up. So we've got. Sorry.
Keith.
All right, go on, Tony. I can't see you on my screen. Carry on.
No, that's because I can't find the bloody hand. It's
well,
just
you
on my screen.
You'll be all right.
it was just reference to the member subgroup. Is that the one we currently have established, or are we talking about the new one? In which case, we should just make that clear, because it may be that members who are on the current subgroup don't wish to continue, or whether we should just formally reappoint them by name. I'm just not clear from the report, because there's nothing in the recommendations, whereas 3.6 has the specific suggestion about the member subgroup guiding the work. So unless I've missed something, I think we should just have a bit of a greater clarity around that would be helpful, I think.
Is it existing?
It is intended that it would be the existing member subgroup, Councillor Page, and what I would suggest that we do on that is that we bring it back to the board meeting in April, setting out who is currently involved in that, confirming whether or not they want to continue with that piece of work, and identifying whether there's any new board members who would like to join that piece of work. Because by the time we get to April, we should have a little bit more development around this and what it might mean, what that work stream looks like.
This is the hugely effective subgroup chair that, of course, I chair. So I think if we could have that back, just so that we can refresh the membership.
With that, we have the 3 recommendations. Are we, again, if I see no hands up, we'll agree them. Yep. Thank you very much. Rachel, a finance update, please.
Yes, thank you again, Chair. So the paper presents an update on the current financial position and also sets out initial thinking for 2021-22. So the first part of the paper focuses on the current financial position to the end of December 2020 and includes the forecast for the end of year spend, which are set out in Appendix A. I don't intend to go into detail on this as the report sets out a considerable amount of information and there's no areas of concern that require flagging at this point. But I am, of course, happy to take questions on any of the information in that at the end of this item. Second item relates to the grant funding from the Department for Transport, which has already been considered earlier. And as mentioned, we have submitted a 1-year funding bid following the decision to delay the 3-year spending round in the autumn. So our 1-year funding bid includes a request for core funding and also includes funding for the completion of the 2 outstanding area studies, the strategic investment plan, and a number of other technical items as well. We do intend to continue to push for the longer term funding certainty, and we are intending to submit a bid for the spending round, which we are expecting will be announced later on this year. So we will be doing that, and we continue to push on that. The third part of the paper relates to the constituent authorities, and up until now, for the last 4 years, our constituent authorities have made an invaluable financial contribution to transport for the South East, and it's enabled us to recruit a small secretariat and to deliver some of our back office functions. That's incredibly welcomed, particularly in what we do understand is a very challenging financial time for local authorities. The Department for Transport have made it clear that they would like to see local contributions continue for subnational transport bodies, and we've set out in the paper that we would like to propose that for 2021 and 22 that we continue to seek local contributions at the same level as previous years, which is £58,000 for county councils, £30,000 for individual unitary authorities, and £58,000 for the authorities that work in partnership in the Berkshire area. One thing I would like to flag on this is that it doesn't cover all of our core costs, and without the DFT funding that we've requested on core costs, we would need to draw down from our reserves for 21-22. And the intention is that at the April board meeting, we will put forward a budget for sign off to the board, which will highlight, hopefully by then we'll have DFT confirmation and we'll be able to explain what the impact would be on our reserves. Next part of the paper is just about a staffing update. This has already been mentioned. We've got 2 members of staff who are funded by DFT, and Appendix 2 includes a new structure chart which sets out for board members how the organisation is shaping up now. And then finally, the paper highlights that work has commenced on the annual report and business plan, and the intention is that they will be presented to the board in April for sign-off. So the board are asked to agree the 5 recommendations as set out in the paper.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? No? Good. Well, we'll look forward to that further update next time. And thanks, Rachel. Thank you for that. So we'll move on to Jeff with the Transport Forum update, please.
Thank you, Keith. Been sitting here eagerly, not sure whether to jump in on previous items or not. So I've tried to behave myself.
Well done.
You've obviously, thank you. You've obviously got a report of on the forum, and I think there's 2 items I want to come back to and stress. So the subject of the most recent meeting was about the challenges and opportunities regarding the future energy supply in relation to transport. And we had 3 very good presentations, I thought. Jason Raymond, from an organisation called Premier Energy, spoke from the perspective of utilities and energy providers. Tom Callow from BP Pulse looked at the challenges and opportunities in the rollout of electric vehicle infrastructure and charging. And our very own Martin Harris spoke obviously about the issues around bus fleets and that sort of thing. And it just became very clear, as has come out once or twice this afternoon, it became very clear that the link between what we think about transport and the energy that drives transport is absolutely fundamental. And the feeling that perhaps at the moment the energy side is not getting the importance that it deserves. You know, we've in electric vehicles, there's still people with range and anxiety, which is put as a reason why not everybody is buying electric vehicles. But the whole thing would have to be a mixture of the bottom up of what we want to achieve in our area and the top down, which is whatever government guidance or direction is going to appear. How is the Chancellor going to replace all the money he gets from petrol and diesel sales? Is this going to affect the price of electricity? Is this going to affect people's decisions on what vehicles they wish to buy? And I think we felt, I think members of the forum felt there was a bit of a vacuum out there. We have some ideas. We had a good discussion, but it's why I asked the Highways Agency, Adam, the question. I don't feel that we are getting clear signals about the long-term strategy to achieve zero carbon by 2050 around the transport sector. So we just need to. So that just came through at the last meeting as a strong message, and I'm sure it's one we will come back to in the future. So that was one thing. The second thing was just going back to the issue of rural mobility. And although we talked about that one 2 meetings ago, we had a continuation of that discussion at the last meeting. And I suppose it summed up in the phrase concern that it was being forgotten. It wasn't getting, that was just the feeling of some members of the forum. But of course, it's very important to many residents in our area. Many live in rural areas. So, you know, of course, there are quite a few issues around rural transport. Partly because promoting good rural transport is a difficult issue. Rural public transport doesn't tend to wash its face, and therefore most of it needs subsidy. And it isn't clear to me whether this is something for TFSE or for the local transport authorities. You know, that will have to be decided. but and indeed it isn't clear. We will become clearer how much attention rural transport will get in the area studies. So we don't want to march off on a new piece of work here without thinking of some of these things. But even, of course, if it's for TFSE to consider, it's likely that any funding wouldn't be available until 2022 to 2023 at the earliest. So just to let people know that in the meantime, or underline the fact that in the meantime, TFSE has joined the Rural Mobility Joint STB Working Group that involves all the other STBs, so that we are staying abreast of the ideas that are coming up from all of the other STBs, so that we can then monitor what happens in our area or doesn't happen, and then decide how to take this forward, or seek the board's guidance on that. But I think, because the thing I've written at the bottom here, at the end of all of our discussion, I was just feeling that this issue isn't going to go away. Yeah. Many people feel very strongly about it, and that's the reason I've gone on a little bit of length about it, because I think it is important to many people, and perhaps at the moment it's not obvious that it's getting the fullest consideration that it requires.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And I think on all of those points, you raised some really interesting decisions that we as TFSE will have to take going forward. I declare my interest as a very rural member. Our bus services have now been cut to one every 2 hours. We did have the luxury of one every hour, and I think it'll be that at peak time. So that means we get 3 buses a day, I think. But it is a genuine worry. And on the direction from government, I'm with you. I mean, as I say, as someone who went to the Zero Carbon Summit all those years ago now, I expected far more strategic guidance on whether we're going to have an electric charging strategy, or whether it's going to be hydrogen. What is it that we're going to do? And I've not seen any of that. And I actually thought that the industry would pick it up, because I actually think vehicle makers and others will have a say in this as well. So all genuinely important stuff that we do need to keep an eye on. So thanks for raising it, and I'm sure we will come back to it. Are there any other comments or questions for Jeff?
Okay. By the time they get to item 13 on the agenda, they've run out of steam, Keith.
Well, we'll have to regenerate them somehow anyway. Thank you for that. So I hope that was agenda item 14, because I'm going on to 15.
14, yeah. Okay.
I'm going on to 15 now, which is Rupert, with the response to consultation, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Don't worry, I've only got about 20 PowerPoint slides. I just want to I just want to do better than Mark. So this is the response to consultation. So as the board will know, our board timetables don't always meet consultation response deadlines. And so I'm just seeking your agreement to the draft responses that we've put into various committees or consultations. The first is the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Devolution. And this is just making the point that STBs and Transport for the South East are credible vehicles for devolution, and we can affect change at a regional scale, and particularly around areas like decarbonisation. And that, specifically for the South East, devolution is quite often seen in the context of mayoral devolved authorities, or mayoral combined authorities rather. And we've got the democratic governance and accountability to not require that. The other one is in relation to the Select Committee on how we can improve transport delivery and project delivery. And again, the points here about the strength of partnership that we have across constituent authorities, the setting of clear objectives and priorities. It is interesting to note the National Infrastructure Strategy is silent on STBs. We think that is a missed trick, and we can help in the delivery of that. And then the final three are responses to local authority, either transport strategies and local transport plans. So that's West Sussex, Surrey and Portsmouth. I won't go into any further detail. Chairman, they're already in the pack. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rupert. Are there any questions for Rupert? None showing. Oh, Rupert, thank you for that. Which then brings us to any other business. So, do we have any other business anyone wants to raise? None showing. Well, then just remind you the date of the next meeting, which is the 26th of April, again at 1 o'clock. And thank you for a very good meeting this afternoon. And any meeting that goes on for 2.5 hours with as much attention being paid as we had so far proves to me that it was worthwhile. So thank you all very much for your attendance, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.